Ride the mercury tide, a fluid and ever-changing flow of information and emotion that defines our modern existence. Dive into these silver stories that shift and evolve as we search for the absolute truth. Hit subscribe now and follow the flow of our unique cinematic art today.
My hands wouldn't stop shaking on the steering wheel, and I'd been driving for 4 hours already with 2 more to go. The voicemail from my neighbor Clive was still playing in my head on loop. I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it. Your son-in-law locked Ethan in the crawl space under the house. I heard screaming and looked over the fence. Your daughter is standing there watching it happen. You need to come home right now. I'd been in Raleigh for a regional sales conference. 3 days. My grandson had been staying with my daughter and her husband while my wife recovered from knee surgery at our house in Greensboro. It was supposed to be 5 days. Just 5 days. I pulled over at a rest stop on I-85 and called my son-in-law's number. He didn't pick up. Called my daughter. She picked up on the 3rd ring, voice bright and easy. "Hey, Dad, how's the conference?" I told her Clive had called me. The line went quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "Clive doesn't know what he's talking about. Ethan's fine. He was being difficult, and Drew handled it." Handled it. My grandson is 7 years old. I pulled back onto the highway and pressed the gas until the speedometer hit 85. I called my son, Brent. He lives 40 minutes from my daughter's house in Clemens. "I need you there before I am," I said. "Don't tell them you're coming." There was a pause. "What happened?" I told him. He said, "I'm already in the car." I had one more call to make. My old partner for my 22 years working insurance fraud investigations. The kind of man who knows how to document things quietly, legally, and permanently before anyone thinks to clean up. "Dennis," I said when he picked up, "I need your eyes on something. Everything you find, save it twice and send it to my encrypted drive. You sound like you did in 2009 when we were working that arson case." "Worse than that," I said. I drove the rest of the way with the radio off. I tried to think about when I first missed it. There's a particular kind of cruelty in that exercise. Going back through the last 2 years and cataloging every moment that felt wrong but that I explained away. The Christmas where Ethan was quieter than usual, and I told myself 7-year-olds go through phases. The July 4th cookout where Drew made some comment about how Ethan needed to toughen up, and I chuckled like it was a parenting philosophy discussion instead of what it actually was. My daughter Sandra had always been stubborn, even as a little girl, and when she married Drew Callister 3 years ago, I thought she'd found someone who matched her energy. Direct, confident, a little hard around the edges. I didn't understand then that there's a difference between confidence and control. I didn't understand what Sandra had been living with behind closed doors, or what she'd allowed to happen to her own son. Ethan is Sandra's from her first relationship. Drew has never legally adopted him. I didn't think that mattered until it started to. The drive from my daughter's house to the house I'd grown up watching Drew treat Ethan like an inconvenience he'd agreed to tolerate. The rules were rigid and arbitrary. No dessert unless the dinner plate was cleaned down to the last green bean, bedtime at 7, regardless of weekends. No friends over because Drew said children's noise gave him migraines. Small things, I told myself. Lots of parents are strict. I was wrong. I just didn't want to look directly at how wrong. Brent was standing on the front porch when I pulled into the driveway at 6:47 p.m. He had his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the look on his face told me everything before he said a word. "The crawl space door is padlocked from the outside," he said. "Ethan's in there. I could hear him through the foundation vent." He stopped screaming. "I don't know if that's better or worse." "Where are they?" Sandra answered the door, said Drew went to get the key. That was 9 minutes ago. I didn't wait. I went around the side of the house to the small wooden access door on the north foundation wall. There was a combination padlock on the latch, the heavy kind, orange, still in its packaging 2 days ago probably. New purchase. I could hear Ethan through the vent slats, not screaming, whimpering. The small, exhausted sound a child makes after screaming hasn't worked. "Ethan," I said through the vent. "It's Granddad. I'm here." A pause, then, "Granddad?" The word cracked in the middle like it wasn't sure it could trust itself. "I'm right here. I'm going to get you out." I went back to the front of the house. Drew had appeared on the porch. He was a big man, 6'2", Former college linebacker with the kind of posture that's always performing, arms loose at his sides, face neutral, like he was watching a minor inconvenience unfold that he'd have to patiently explain. He had a meltdown, Drew said. Threw a plate. I needed him to calm down somewhere he couldn't break anything else. Open the lock, I said. He needs to understand there are consequences. Open the lock. You don't get to come onto my property and... I looked at my son-in-law for a long moment. 22 years as a fraud investigator teaches you to weed bases under pressure. What I saw in Drew's face wasn't anger. It was the particular calculation of a man deciding how much trouble he was in and whether he could still manage the narrative. You can open the lock, I said, or you can explain to the Forsyth County Sheriff why you put a 7-year-old child in a crawl space and padlocked the door. Those are your two options. Drew opened the lock. The crawl space under that house was about 18 inches of clearance, concrete floor, exposed insulation, and God only knows what else in the dark. Ethan had been in there for somewhere between 40 minutes and an hour, based on what Clive had told me. My son reached in first because he was closer to the ground, and I heard Ethan make a sound I am going to hear for the rest of my life when Brent's hand found him. He came out covered in insulation fibers and dirt, both knees scraped from the concrete. He was shaking hard enough that I could feel it when I pulled him against my chest. He didn't say anything for a long time, just held onto my shirt collar with both fists. When he finally spoke, he said, I didn't break the plate on purpose, it slipped. That was what he needed to explain. At 7 years old, locked under a house in the dark, his first concern when he saw me was making sure I knew it was an accident. My daughter was standing in the doorway watching. Her face was doing something complicated, not guilt exactly, more like the expression of someone who has arranged something in their head a particular way for so long that having it rearranged out loud is physically uncomfortable. He's fine, she said. Drew wouldn't actually, he was just... Sandra. I said her name the same way I had when she was 16 and I'd found out she'd been lying to me for 3 months about where she was going on Friday nights. Not angry, just direct and sad and finished. She stopped talking. I carried Ethan to my car and put him in the back seat. Brent had called 911 from the driveway while I was getting Ethan out. The Forsyth County Sheriff's deputies arrived 17 minutes later. 2 units. Drew was still on the porch. He'd gotten quieter and more polished, which I recognized as the shift into full management mode. I'd seen it in fraud suspects 100 times. The loud denial is amateur hour. The calm, reasonable explanation is when they think they're winning. He told the deputies that Ethan had thrown a plate and broken a window, and that the crawl space was a timeout space they'd used before, just for a few minutes to let him calm down. The padlock was for safety, he said, so Ethan wouldn't push the door open and run into the yard while he was upset. For safety. I gave the deputies Clive's number. Clive had filmed 11 seconds on his phone before calling me, holding it through the gap in the fence boards, shaky, poorly lit, but clear enough. Drew's voice, you want to come out? Stern, acting like it. Ethan's voice from under the house, still full volume, screaming at that point, please, please. Sandra's voice, quieter, from somewhere near the porch steps. Just leave him. He'll tire out. The deputy's expression didn't change when she watched the video. She'd seen things, but she watched it twice. Dennis had driven down from Winston-Salem by the time we got to the ER at Wake Forest Baptist. He sat in the waiting room with his laptop open, and that particular look he gets when he's pulling threads. The pediatric attending documented 7 bruises on Ethan's legs and lower back, all in different stages of healing. 2 on his right thigh that were the specific oval shape you get from fingers gripping hard. The attending used phrases like consistent with non-accidental injury and a pattern inconsistent with normal childhood activity. She was kind but precise, and I noticed she didn't make eye contact with Ethan when she wrote things down. Just with him, directly, when she talked to him. Smart woman. She knew what she was doing. Ethan told her that Drew gets grabby when he's mad. He said it the way a child says something they've already worked out in their own mind, as just being the way things are. Not an accusation, a fact of his life. I had to step outside the exam room for a minute after he said that. I stood in the hallway under the fluorescent lights and thought about all the times I'd dropped him off at that house, buckled him into the back seat, kissed the top of his head, watched Sandra wave from the door. All the normal-looking moments that had this underneath them the whole time. When I came back in, Ethan was drawing on the paper on the exam table with a pen the attending had given him. He was drawing a horse. His grandmother had taken him to a farm once 2 years ago, and he hadn't stopped talking about the horses since. "Granddad," he said without looking up, "am I going home with you?" "Yes," I said. He kept drawing. "Good," he said. "Just that. Good." Dennis found the first thing that same night. It wasn't about Ethan directly. It was about money. My daughter and her husband had taken out a $350,000 life insurance policy on Ethan 14 months ago. The beneficiary wasn't Sandra. It was Drew. I stared at that document on Dennis's screen for a long time. "There's more," Dennis said. He pulled up property records. Drew had listed the house in Clemens for sale 6 weeks ago with a real estate agent in Charlotte, without telling Sandra. The listing had been withdrawn after 2 weeks, but it had been live. "He was making plans," I said. "Looks that way, and there's something else." Dennis turned the laptop toward me. I pulled his business registration records. He runs a residential contracting company, has a business checking account, also has a second personal account his wife probably doesn't know about, based on the address on file. Sandra didn't know about any of it. I was certain of that, not because Sandra was blameless in what had been happening to Ethan, but because I know my daughter. She is not capable of calculating financial strategy. She is impulsive and defensive and capable of being controlled by someone patient enough to manage her emotional reactions. Drew was patient. He'd been building something for years. I thought about the life insurance policy. I thought about how frequently Drew had suggested I take Ethan for longer visits over the last 6 months. How he once mentioned, carefully casual, that Ethan's behavior problems were getting worse and maybe a different home environment would be better long term. How Sandra had started repeating that back to me, word for word, in a way that didn't sound like her at all. I picked up my phone and called a Child Protective Services attorney. It was 11:30 at night. She called me back 20 minutes later because Dennis had used a mutual contact to explain the situation. "Get me everything you have by morning," she said. "My wife found out when Brent brought Ethan to our house that night. Her name is Loretta, and she has a titanium spine under the quiet exterior, which is something you discover about a person over 31 years of marriage. She was supposed to be off her feet recovering from knee surgery. She was standing in the kitchen making grilled cheese when we walked in. She took one look at Ethan, and then she looked at me and I watched her understand everything without me having to say a word. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened her arms, and Ethan walked right into them without hesitating, still in the hospital bracelet, insulation fibers still in his hair. "You're staying here," she told him. "Okay," he said like it was that simple, and maybe for him in that moment it was. She looked at me over his head. "Fix it," her eyes said. "All of it." I went back to the kitchen table where Dennis had his laptop open, and I got to work. The CPS investigation was opened that night. A caseworker came to my house the next morning to interview Ethan with a child advocate present. I sat in the hallway and listened to him answer questions in his steady, matter-of-fact 7-year-old voice. Children who have normalized something describe it without drama. That's actually more damaging to hear than if he'd been upset. He just talked about it. Drew gets grabby. The crawl space is where he goes when he broke something. Mommy doesn't usually come get him because she says he needs to learn. She says he needs to learn. The caseworker came out of that room with a very specific look on her face. I recognized it. The closed-down professional expression that means what she just heard will stay with her for a long time. Drew was arrested that afternoon. Child abuse, false imprisonment, child endangerment. The DA's office called the insurance policy a significant line of inquiry and said more charges might follow pending a financial investigation. Sandra was not arrested. Not yet. She was brought in for questioning and released. Her attorney, whom Drew had arranged and paid for, something she apparently didn't question, told her to stop talking to me. She called me anyway from a gas station payphone, which told me she knew her cell was being monitored by someone. "Dad," she said, and her voice was the voice of my 23-year-old daughter the night she called me from a hospital parking lot after Ethan was born, scared and overwhelmed and trying not to show it. "I didn't know about the insurance. I swear to God I didn't know." "I believe you," I said, "because I did." He said the crawl space was just discipline. He said I was too soft with Ethan. He said... She stopped. He said a lot of things. For a long time. and I started to believe them. I know. Is Ethan okay? He ate 2 grilled cheeses last night and slept 9 hours, I said. He asked for pancakes this morning. I heard her make a sound that wasn't quite a cry, more like someone releasing a breath they've been holding for 2 years. What do I do? She asked. You get a different lawyer, I said, one Drew didn't hire. You tell the truth, all of it from the beginning, and you do whatever the family court tells you to do. There was a long pause. Will they let me see him? That's not up to me, I said. But if you do everything right, Sandra, if you cooperate completely and you're honest, I'll tell them that. I will tell them you called me the minute you could. She was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, Dad. I know you are, I said. Start now. Dennis spent the next 2 weeks being extraordinarily thorough. The second personal bank account had $47,000 in it from contractor payments that had never been reported to the IRS. Dennis made sure the relevant information reached the IRS fraud tip line, as well as the North Carolina Licensing Board for General Contractors, because it turned out 2 of Drew's jobs had been completed without proper permits. The real estate listing that had been quietly withdrawn. Dennis found the agent in Charlotte, who confirmed Drew had been inquiring about cash transactions and out-of-state relocation. The DA's Financial Crimes Unit found that interesting. The life insurance policy on Ethan was investigated by the insurer's own fraud department once Dennis had provided them documentation suggesting the policy was opened under circumstances worth examining. The policy was suspended pending review. None of what Dennis did was illegal. Every piece of information he provided went through proper channels to the proper authorities, documented in writing. That matters. When you spent 22 years in fraud investigation, you understand that the most durable justice is the kind that's been handled correctly from the start, the kind they can't appeal on procedural grounds because everything was done exactly right. Drew's contracting business lost its license within 30 days. The IRS matter opened a separate investigation. The DA added tax fraud and financial fraud to the existing charges. His lawyer asked for 3 continuances. The evidence kept getting worse for him. The family court proceeding for Ethan's custody was quiet compared to the criminal case. Temporary full custody was granted to me and Loretta within the first week. I submitted the documentation, the medical records, Clive's video, Dennis's financial findings, the CPS caseworker's report, and Ethan's own statements through his child advocate. The guardian ad litem assigned to Ethan was a retired family court judge named Harriet, who wore comfortable shoes and had the manner of someone who had seen every version of this situation and still approached each one with fresh attention. She interviewed Ethan twice, once at my house with Loretta present and once alone. After the second interview, she stopped by the kitchen where I was pretending to read the newspaper. He asked me if horses can tell when they're safe somewhere new, she said, or if they have to figure it out themselves. I set the newspaper down. I told him I thought they could tell, she said. He seemed satisfied with that. She recommended permanent custody to me and Loretta, with supervised visitation for Sandra pending completion of a 12-month therapeutic program and parenting evaluation. Drew would have no visitation or contact of any kind. The judge accepted her recommendation in full. Drew's criminal trial was set for the following spring. He pled not guilty on all counts, and his new attorney, the third one, tried to argue the crawlspace incident was an isolated moment of poor judgment in an otherwise stable home. The DA played Clive's video. The DA read the medical examiner's documentation of the bruises. The DA submitted 8 months of text messages between Drew and a buddy in Mecklenburg County, in which Drew referred to Ethan using language I'm not going to repeat here, and in which he discussed, casually, how much easier his life would be without a stepkid dragging everything down. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. Drew Callister received 12 years in federal prison for child abuse, aggravated child endangerment, false imprisonment, and financial fraud. The judge, a quiet man in his 60s named Judge Farrell, who had the demeanor of someone who chose his words once and meant them, addressed Drew before sentencing with the particular economy of language that lands harder than volume. You looked at a child in your care and made a calculation, Judge Farrell said. You decided his suffering was a tool. You decided his life was an inconvenience with a dollar amount attached. This court has no appropriate response to that, except to ensure you spend a significant portion of your life removed from any child's vicinity. Drew's attorney had been preparing to speak to mitigating factors. He didn't bother. Sandra completed her first 3 months of the therapeutic program and was granted supervised visits every other Saturday. The first visit was at a neutral location with a family advocate present. I drove Ethan there myself. In the parking lot, he sat in the back seat very still for a minute. "What if it's weird?" he asked. "It probably will be," I said. "That's allowed." He thought about that. "Okay," he said. He came out an hour later with the drawing Sandra had made for him. She'd drawn it during the session, apparently, when they'd run out of things to say, and the advocate suggested an activity. She'd drawn him a horse. He showed it to me very seriously on the drive home. "It's not as good as mine," he said, which made me laugh for the first time in months. Real laughter. The kind that comes from somewhere true. "No," I agreed. "Yours are better." He thought about that for a minute, watching the road. "Maybe I can teach her sometime," he said. I didn't say anything to that. I just kept driving, and I let that sit between us in the car, small and complicated and full of the kind of hope that belongs entirely to children, the kind that survives things it has no business surviving. It's been 11 months since that afternoon in Raleigh when my phone rang and everything changed. Ethan turned 8 in October. Loretta made him a horse-shaped cake, which he found both impressive and slightly concerning because he felt bad eating it. We have a standing Saturday trip to a farm in Guilford County, where they do beginner riding lessons. He started to sit in the saddle with less of that careful stillness he carried everywhere when he first came to us. The watchfulness of a child who has learned to monitor adults for signs of danger. It's easing, slowly. His therapist says he's making real progress. She says he's bright and emotionally articulate, and that the main thing he needs is consistency and time, and that we are giving him both. I don't sleep perfectly yet. I don't think I will for a while. There is a particular kind of grief in realizing you were in the vicinity of something and didn't see it in time. I'm working on that. My own therapist, who I started seeing in November, tells me that guilt and responsibility are not the same thing and that I should practice telling them apart. I'm working on that too. What I know is this. The morning after everything broke open, before the CPS worker came, before the attorney called back, before any of it, I went into the spare bedroom where Ethan was sleeping and I stood in the doorway for a minute. He was completely out, face slack, one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress the way kids sleep when they finally feel safe enough to let their bodies go loose. I'd watched my own children sleep like that when they were small. Sandra, Brent, all those years ago. I hadn't understood until that moment how much I needed to see it again. I pulled the door mostly closed, went back to the kitchen table, and got back to work. Because that's what you do. You don't wait for the moment to feel finished or clean or resolved. You do the next right thing, and then the next one, and you keep going until the people who need protecting are protected. The rest takes care of itself in time. I keep coming back to the moment Ethan said, "I didn't break the plate on purpose. It slipped." That was the first thing out of his mouth after being locked in the dark for nearly an hour. Not anger, not accusations, just a 7-year-old. Needing the person he trusted most to know he hadn't done something wrong on purpose. That's what cruelty does when it's applied long enough. It doesn't just hurt a child. It teaches them to preemptively apologize for their own existence. I've thought a lot about what Drew was at his core. Not just cruel, calculated. He understood that control works best when the person being controlled doesn't recognize it as control. He managed Sandra the same way he managed Ethan, slowly, over years, replacing her own judgment with his, until she was standing on a porch watching her son suffer and telling herself it was discipline. What Drew had was a kind of cold intelligence in service of something rotten. Intelligence without any kind of decency underneath it doesn't build anything. It only takes. And what stopped him wasn't luck. It was a chain of people who chose to act when it would have been easier not to. Clive, who could have convinced himself it wasn't his business, climbed the fence and filmed 11 seconds that changed everything. Brent, who drove 40 minutes without asking why. Dennis, who spent 2 weeks being methodical and thorough because he understood that sloppy documentation protects the wrong people. Every one of them made a choice that required something. The willingness to get involved, the patience to do it right, the refusal to look away. I think about the version of this story where I don't call Dennis, where I just drove home furious and confronted Drew without documentation, without the financial records, without the chain of evidence already preserved. Drew would have had lawyers and explanations, and the padlock might have been the only thing anyone could prove. He was banking on exactly that. Men like Drew count on the people around them acting on emotion rather than strategy. They count on the response being loud and fast and therefore easy to discredit. I was angry enough to be loud. I chose to be quiet instead. That's the only reason the outcome looks the way it does. I'm not saying I did everything right. I didn't see what was happening in that house soon enough. I explained away things I shouldn't have explained away. That's something I'll carry. But I've learned that there's a difference between carrying guilt and being paralyzed by it. Ethan needed me present and functional, not collapsed under the weight of what I missed, so I stayed functional. I kept moving. I did the next right thing. What I hope Ethan takes from all of this, when he's old enough to understand it fully, is not just that his grandfather fought for him. I hope he sees the whole picture. That the people who heard him were exposed because other people had the moral backbone to tell the truth, the clarity of mind to handle it correctly, and the sheer stubbornness to keep going until every door was closed to the people who'd wronged him. Those three things together are what justice actually looks like in practice. Not dramatic, not loud, methodical, persistent, and grounded in doing what's right even when it's slow. Ethan asked me once, a few months after everything's settled, whether bad people know they're bad. I thought about Drew. About the way he stood on that porch, calm and explanatory, while my grandson was under the house in the dark. Some of them do, I said, and they count on everyone else being too uncertain to say so out loud. He thought about that for a while. I'm going to be loud, he said. Good, I told him. Me too.